Hey guys, Paul Lynn here, talking to you today about some photography stuff. And this is a pretty basic topic, but it's something that whenever people are getting started off in photography, especially when they're getting started using a halfway serious camera. I mean, hell, even cell phones have this functionality these days, but you start hearing about shooting in RAW. And you've got, your normal JPEGs whenever you take a picture with whatever camera. Most of the time when I'm shooting my biggest and best cameras, I'm producing JPEGs as well as RAWs. And then most of the time when you're shooting with your cell phone, all you get is a JPEG. But then you've got these higher end camera phones that, now you've actually got RAW functionality built into those cameras. So you can take your cell phone and tell it to spit out RAW files or RAW files plus JPEGs. And if you talk to anybody who knows that much about photography, that person's going to tell you, oh, you got to shoot RAW. RAW is the best. And it's just, and you take a look at a JPEG and you look at a RAW file, and the first thing you notice is that RAW file is this big and that JPEG is a little tiny file size. I'm not talking about the size of the picture. I'm talking about the size of the file sitting on your disk. And you're like, wow, this RAW file is much larger than the JPEG. I can't email that to anybody. Uploading it takes a while. And then half of the time when I try to open it, my computer or whatever says, oh, unknown file type, don't know what to do with this, can't show you the picture anyway. So at this point, you're like, well, everyone says RAW is better. And I mean, I can see from the file size, there's a lot more information there. But honestly, when I open it up, looks the same as my JPEG. So, I mean, why all the nuisance? Why all the trouble? I'll just stick with the smaller, more useful JPEG, which looks exactly the same, takes up a lot less space, and has been doing the job all this time, right? Kind of makes sense. But there really is a lot of benefit to that RAW file. And that information, I'm going to explain kind of how all that extra information in the RAW file works. There are a ton of benefits to RAW files. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but the main thing that 90% of the time you're really going to care about, that's what I want to show you today and kind of walk you through. So, first question is, why the hell is your RAW file so big? It's like several megs, and then maybe your JPEG is only a couple hundred kilobytes on the disk. Why is that file so much bigger? And the first thing that I want to explain to you is dynamic range, okay? That's kind of a complicated topic if you don't already know what it is. But think about it this way. Whenever you go outside, you're out walking in the park, and you look down in the shadow under some bushes or under a tree, and you have to adjust your eyes for a second because you look under there and everything's kind of dark. And then you've got the sun just blasting light in your eyes. And so you have to do this number here where you block the sun and cover your eyes, and you have to stare for 5 or 10 seconds until your eyes adjust. And now you can kind of see what's going on in the shadow, right? And then when your eyes get adjusted to the shadow, now you look back up in the sky and you're just like, it's just blindingly bright. You're like, I can't see anything. And you're squinting your eyes and your eyes are watering like a little, whiny little girl. And you're like, oh, what's up? And you squint for a couple of seconds and wipe your eyes, and then finally your eyes adjust. And now you can see the shapes of the clouds, and you can see some birds flying by, and you can see all the detail of what's going on in the sky. And then when you look back down into the shadow, you can't see anything again, and it just all looks dark and black, and you can't make out detail of anything. When you take a picture, it works the same way. You've got this thing called exposure, right? And that means a detail in a certain amount of light will be properly exposed in your photograph. Now, here's the kind of weird thing about it. Think about it. Your eyes are adjusted to the shadow, which means they can't see what's going on in the light very well. And when they're well adjusted in the bright light, they can't see anything in the shadow. Your camera is just a kind of eye. It works the same way, right? So when you think about it, if I want to take a picture of something in the shadow, I'm going to adjust my exposure on my camera, a combination of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. I'm going to adjust it so that it's properly exposed. It shows up nice and bright and clear in my photo. But what if in that photo, that same frame, you can see what's going on down in the shadow, but inside of the frame, you can also see a little bit of sky, some other trees, the grass, and stuff like that, right? Well, think about it. If I've got the thing in the shadow properly exposed, then what's up in the sky with all that light is going to be dramatically overexposed, which means it's going to get brighter, 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 and then it's going to be so bright, everything just turns white and washes out. So even though when I look up in the sky, it's a nice blue sky with fluffy white clouds and a black bird flying by, in my photograph, if I've exposed properly for what's in the shadow, when I see the sky, it's just going to look white, which means I'm not seeing the actual sky. I don't see any of the reality of what the sky looks like. There's no detail. All of that information has been blown out and it is lost. It's gone. Well, so let's get smart. We say, we're going to fix that. So now I take the same picture again, but I'm going to expose properly for the sky. And now when I look into my camera, I can see a blue sky and fluffy white birds, and I can see everything, and I go click, and I take that picture. And when I look at my picture, sure enough, the sky looks magnificent. It's a work of art. It's beautiful. And when I look back down under the bush in the shadow where that mama cat is nursing her little kittens or whatever cute ass thing I wanted to take a picture of in the first place, guess what? Because my sky with all that light is now properly exposed, what's going on down here in the shade is dramatically underexposed, which means it went darker, 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 black, and it disappeared. There's no detail. I see a bush here, and then everything under that bush is just the heart of darkness, okay? It's black, the blackest of blackness. It's just, there's no detail, there's no shape, there's no lines, dots, figures, outlines. Everything's just dark. And if by some miracle you actually can still see any detail down there, it's certainly nothing that's going to catch the eye because it's so dark and the eye goes to the light. The eye always, when it looks at a picture, it always tries to chase the light. So you've blown it out. It's gone. So then, you try one last resort. You say, well, I'm going to adjust the exposure somewhere in the middle so that it's not adjusted for the sky, it's not exposed for the darkness, it's kind of in the middle. And you take that picture, and now your sky is overexposed, but not 100% blown out. Instead of a rich blue sky, you have this really wimpy, watery, light baby blue sky, and you can barely even see the clouds because the blue is so close to white. And when you look down under the bush, you can maybe see the cat, but you can't really tell. You can't really see that it has spots on its fur, and you can just make out the outlines of the kittens. And I mean, the detail there's some detail there, but you've still lost a lot of it. So now you're not well exposed for the sky or for the shadow. What do? Well, there's something called HDR photography. You can actually do high dynamic range work where you expose for the sky, expose for the under the bush, expose somewhere in the middle, take these three images, combine them in Photoshop, and bring out the detail in the whole thing, but then you have to take the same picture 3 times, and if you're holding it in your hand, obviously it's going to move around a little bit, so those 3 pictures are not going to line up perfectly. I mean, there's ways to work that out, but it's kind of a nuisance. If you've got a tripod, that makes it a lot easier. But what if I told you you can take one picture and get all of that detail at once? All right? That's what a raw image is. A JPEG has a dynamic range, okay, that's that big. What is a dynamic range anyway? Just like your eyes, they can only be exposed to darkness or light. They can't take in the light and the darkness and get all of that detail at the same time. Neither can a JPEG. A JPEG can only handle so much dynamic range from that camera's processor. But a RAW file has a much broader dynamic range, okay? So think about it as a really powerful eye that can take in a lot more detail, a lot more dynamic or changing range of light values from very, very bright up in the sky to very, very dark down in the shadows. It can take in all of that, and not all necessarily, but a lot more than you can fit in a JPEG, and it can capture a lot more detail. All right? So now whenever I go to edit my JPEG, if I've only exposed for darkness or light, I've lost the other one. Whichever one I exposed for, I lost all my detail from the other one. Whereas if I shot in RAW, it's quite possible that I have all of my detail from both, depending on where my exposure was. Now, if my exposure was somewhere in the middle, there's a good chance that I'm going to be able to extract all of the detail from the sky and all of the detail from the shadow at the same time. And I'm going to be able to combine all of that and turn it into one single JPEG that shows all of that detail. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to sit down on my computer, show you a picture that I took right before recording this, just aiming the camera out the window and capturing a street scene where you can see what's going on down the street in the sky. And I'm going to use that to show you what a JPEG looks like, show you the exact same RAW file created at the same time when my camera captured that JPEG, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff we can do with that RAW file whenever we're processing that in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. And you can see that I've got this first JPEG, and you can see this is a JPEG. I've got this first JPEG in front of me, and this looks pretty overexposed. And then I've also got another one, and this one is pretty underexposed. So neither one of these is a really saleable image. And let's see if I can tweak my brightness level on this, or tweak my curves or something like that to try to turn this into something useful, right? So I've gone ahead and added an adjustment layer here for brightness and contrast. And I'm going to just take this brightness slider and I'm going to try to dial it down. And you can see my sky is gone, right? I can darken everything so dark that it all starts to look very kind of cartoony, right? So, that's pushing this beyond the actual information that's in this JPEG. And you can see that sky is blown out. It's white, and that's all it's ever going to be from this JPEG, unfortunately. This one, you can see now, look in the sky. You can see there's some mountains there. You can see there's plenty of clouds. There's a lot of information that was left out of that other image. And down on the ground, you can still see the detail, but you can see that there's a lot of dark areas with these trees and on some of these buildings. So let's try to dial that up. And you can see, I can get most of my detail, but there are some parts like on these trees where it seems to be black and there's no coming back. Like on this building, there's just a black stripe down that building, and that's all it's ever going to be. And by the time I dial it up there, I've pretty much lost my sky. And even when I dial my sky down, you can see, there's detail there, but there's not a lot of color, okay? So I've got two JPEGs here, which, I'm sorry, but there's no saving these. Yeah, maybe you can use AI and, some, different fill techniques, and you can tweak the colors and everything, and you can try to make it look original, but you're adding information to these images which is not already there. Whereas you're going to see with RAW, we can actually get that information back. So here we go. You see these 1361 and 1364 are the JPEGs, and we've got the same numbers on these raw files that were created at the same time. So let's start with the overexposed one, and let's take a look at that. And now you can see this image really looks a lot like the JPEG that we had, right? The difference is, let's take a look over here, and you see I've got exposure control. Watch what happens when I dial this down. You see, now I can get some information out of that sky, which wasn't there before. I'm still so overexposed that I can't get all of my detail from the sky, but you see how that mountain is appearing there? And, you look at everything down below, I can make everything down below look pretty realistic. If I dial it down, you can see I've still got some blown out missing details up here on my histogram, but I can get mountains out of here. Whereas on the JPEG, whenever I try to dial that down, there's no mountains to be seen. So the raw file isn't going to capture a 100% infinite dynamic range, but it's certainly going to give us more detail than the JPEG does. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now let's look at this underexposed. Now with this one, we're going to be able to get a whole lot more detail out of this, and we're going to turn this into a saleable image. So let's go ahead and open our RAW in Photoshop. All right, now take a look at this when I dial the exposure down. You see I can get a nice looking sky. I can get a ton of detail out of that sky. And I'm going to come down here to vibrance, and I'm going to dial that vibrance up a little bit, dial that saturation up a little bit. Let's also dehaze this image to try to get rid of some of the haze, bring that saturation back down, and turn this into something that kind of looks pretty natural and full of details, okay? So that sky doesn't look too bad. I'm going to go ahead and open that, and now we've got a pretty good sky in Photoshop, right? I'm going to go back to our RAW, and I'm going to open it again with Photoshop. And now I'm going to take that exposure and I'm going to dial it up and get a pretty good looking exposure for what's going on the ground. And same thing, I'm going to tweak the vibrance a little bit just to make the colors pop. And let's not dial that saturation up so much that it looks cartoony, but bring it down something, yeah, pretty much close to 0. And that's going to give us a pretty natural look. And I'm going to go ahead and open that. I'm going to copy this image and paste it onto this one. So now we've got both of our images in one file. I'm going to select both of those layers, come up here to edit, and come down to auto blend layers. I'm going to blend those as a stack and hit OK. Photoshop's going to work and pull out the details in both. And there we go. Now we've got an image which we can see the sky, we can see the details, we can see the ground, and it kind of changed our tones a little bit on those, it seems like. So I'm not necessarily loving the end result, but the important thing is you can see where we started. You know, we had something that was underexposed on the ground, overexposed in the sky, and nothing was really clear. Whereas whenever we took our RAW file and processed it, you know, now we've got something that actually shows what's going on the ground, shows what's going on up above. And if we wanted to from here, you know, now we could even, you know, add some color into the sky and, you know, try to kind of make it pop a little bit more and darken those blues and things like that. This isn't really a photo editing lecture so much as just showing you the power of RAW, but that's what I wanted you to see, that if you get a pretty good exposure with RAW, you can bring a lot more detail out of your highlights and out of your shadows. Whereas if you take an image and it's nothing but a JPEG, if you lose detail in your shadows, there's probably no bringing it back. And if you lose detail in your highlights, there's nowhere where it's saved that you can recover it from without adding information into your image and, you know, copy and pasting something in there. The RAW file has a ton more information in that wider dynamic range than your JPEG's going to ever have. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. Now, I hope you have a much better idea of what RAW images are for. You can do a lot more in terms of flexibility with noise control and sharpening and color toning and adjustments. There's a lot more flexibility that's inherent in a RAW file than a JPEG. You can do a lot with a JPEG. You can process it. You can edit it in Photoshop, but you cannot do nearly as much without, you know, breaking some things and losing detail and destructively editing a JPEG in Photoshop to get the results you want. Whereas with a RAW file, you've got so much information there that you can bend it, twist it, reprocess it a lot of different ways, and you've lost nothing, okay? So I'm not going to go into all of that today. Well, that'll be, you know, food for several other videos in the future. But for right now, this is the most useful and most obvious benefit to RAW photos. If you're shooting outdoors, you're going to usually have a much wider dynamic range than if you're shooting indoors like in a studio or something like that. So RAW files can be very, very useful unless you want black shadows and white skies. And let's face it, you're never going to win Photograph of the Year if you've got a white sky or a black shadow area. So anyway, that's it. That's what I've got for you today. Hope you learned something. Hope RAW files make a lot more sense to you now. And no, you don't need to shoot everything in RAW all the time, But obviously, if you're shooting anything that you want to make it look really good, and especially you're shooting outdoors, I do highly recommend shooting RAW. There's a little more work that'll go into it after the fact, but when you need it and when you realize your JPEG has lost a lot of detail, you'll be glad you've got that RAW file there. Thank you so much for watching today. Please click the like button if you don't mind on your way out the door. Also subscribe if you like what I'm doing, because I will keep doing it. Thanks again for watching. You have a lovely day. Cheers.